Counsel?
Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. LeGrand, you have an exhibit book in front of you. Would you please turn to tab 36? Your Honor, I believe the next exhibit, defense exhibit, would be number 5037, which would be this document.
All right, thank you.
Mr. LeGrand, please take a look at that document, if you would.
Yes.
Have you seen that document before?
Yes.
And please describe that document.
It's charts and diagrams and text outlining kind of a business structure for Michael Jackson.
And it appears that you faxed that document to various individuals on March 14, 2003, correct?
Yeah, well, it appears that it was faxed to Mr. Al Maunick.
But you appear to be it appears to have been faxed from your office, right?
Oh, yes.
All right, now, when did you first see that document?
I'm not sure. I think I saw an iteration of this document in late 2002. This was a business plan outline that Mr. Konitzer had been working on for some time.
And was it your understanding that Konitzer put this document together?
Yes.
And what is your understanding based on?
He sent this to me. Mr. Konitzer gave this to me.
And approximately when do you think he did that?
Well, again, this iteration I'm going to say happened in probably February, but this was a document that got edited over time. But I think this generation, because of some references in it, time references, I think show late February, maybe early March.
Did Mr. Konitzer tell you he was developing this document?
Yes.
Approximately when was that?
I'm guessing, sometime February, early March of 2003.
And correct me if I'm wrong, the document appears to be a business plan for Mr. Jackson, right?
Yes.
And if you look through the document, it appears to have what is referred to as a diagram of a business structure, right?
Yes.
It talks about Mr. Jackson and his family, correct?
Yes.
I'll object as leading, and hearsay as far as the document is concerned.
Sustained.
You need to turn your microphone on as well.
Yeah.
Mr. LeGrand, please look at what appears to be the third page of that document. Okay. The Bates stamp number appears to be MJ020806. Do you see that?
Yes.
And it says, how to protect MJ from business infection. Do you see that?
Objection. Hearsay and leading.
Sustained.
Do you recall reading this document when you received it?
Yes.
And why did you read it?
Because it was given to me for my review, and it affected my client, Michael Jackson.
And this is a copy of the actual document that Konitzer sent you, correct?
Yes.
And after you read it, did you discuss it with Mr. Konitzer?
I don't recall a specific conversation about this document, no.
Do you recall that one of the plans Mr. Konitzer had for Mr. Jackson was to isolate him from involvement?
Objection. Hearsay and leading.
The hearsay is sustained.
Please turn to page Bates stamp MJ020810, if you would.
Yes.
And it's entitled, Michael's Involvement, correct?
Yes.
Objection. Hearsay. Leading.
Sustained.
Do you remember having any discussions with Mr. Konitzer about Michael Jackson's involvement in the new business plan?
Yes.
Were there any discussions about whether or not Michael Jackson should be involved in briefings, formalities, procedures, etc.?
Objection. Hearsay. Leading.
Sustained.
Do you know whether or not you had any discussions with Mr. Konitzer about whether Michael Jackson needed to be involved in daily briefings?
Same objection.
Sustained.
You've seen that document before, right?
Yes.
Do you recall any discussions with Mr. Konitzer about how involved Mr. Jackson should be in the new business?
Same objection.
Sustained.
Did you ever say anything to Mr. Konitzer about to what extent Mr. Jackson should be involved in the new business plan?
Yes.
What did you say?
Objection. Hearsay.
Sustained.
Did Mr. Konitzer's plan, to the best of your knowledge, involve any considerations about how much Mr. Jackson should be involved in his own business dealings?
Same objection.
Sustained.
Mr. LeGrand, Konitzer didn't want Michael Jackson involved at all in the details of his business, did he?
Same objection. Ask counsel to move off this subject. Ask the court to admonish counsel.
Your microphone's off, sir.
I'm sorry. Same objection and ask the court to admonish counsel to move off of this subject.
I think that question was asked and answered earlier this morning, so I'll sustain it on that ground.
Okay. Is the document in front of you that's been identified as Exhibit 5037 prepared in the normal course of business, to your knowledge?
As normal as business was, yes.
And you faxed it off to Mr. Malnick, correct?
Yes.
And why did you do that?
Because I thought Mr. Malnick at that point was advising Mr. Jackson on business matters. And I thought it very much appropriate for Mr. Malnick to see this document.
Is Exhibit 5037 the actual document you faxed to Mr. Malnick on March 14, 2003?
To the best of my recollection, yes.
Did you discuss the document with Mr. Malnick at any point?
Yes.
Approximately when was that, do you think?
I would guess within a day or two of this fax. Maybe that day, but I don't know for sure.
Do you recall discussing Exhibit 5037 with anyone besides Mr. Malnick and Mr. Konitzer?
Oh, I believe I discussed this with my partner, Pete Gibson.
And why did you do that?
I found this document to be somewhat disturbing. It seems amateurish. You know, I already had misgivings about Mr. Konitzer's sophistication and capabilities, and this document simply reinforced those concerns.
After you read the document, what were you concerned about?
Well,
I'm going to object that this is going to be a commentary of what's enclosed within the document.
Sustained.
No further questions at this time, Your Honor.
Okay.
Good afternoon, Mr. LeGrand.
good afternoon. We made it to the afternoon.
Just barely. So tell me, how is it that you became employed by Michael Jackson?
Mr. Konitzer had talked to me about whether I would be interested in assisting with the implementation of this new business plan for Mr. Jackson, and then Mr. Konitzer called me and asked me to come to Florida and meet Mr. Jackson to discuss representation.
And you knew Mr. Konitzer through a company named High Tech?
High Tech America?
And what is High Tech America?
I don't know what it is. A few years ago it was a company Mr. Konitzer had that was involved in developing a manufactured building process.
And is that company based in Canada?
Yeah. Mr. Konitzer lives in Canada, and the manufacturing company was in Canada, but Mr. Konitzer was interested in developing business in the United States when I first met him.
And how is it that he came to employ your services for High Tech America?
He was introduced to me by another person that I knew in Florida. And we discussed, what his needs were, and at the time I was with a law firm and we agreed to represent him.
What were you doing in Florida at the time?
I really wasn't in Florida. I had done a transaction with some people in Florida, and one of those people subsequently introduced Mr. Konitzer to me.
And at some point Mr. Konitzer called you and informed you that he'd like you to work on behalf of Mr. Jackson?
Yes.
And did he introduce you to Michael Jackson?
Yes.
Where did that introduction take place?
I think it's the Turnberry Hotel project in Florida.
And did that introduction take place in February of 2003?
Yes. No, I think it was January.
January of 2003?
Yeah, I don't think it was quite February. I think it was the last weekend in January.
And when Mr. Konitzer contacted you with regard to your services, exactly what did he inform you of in terms of what the expectation would be of your duties? What duties you'd perform for Mr. Jackson?
The phone call that precipitated my going to meet Mr. Jackson at the Turnberry was focused on the Bashir broadcast. And what Mr. Konitzer said to me was that Michael's lawyers had told him there was nothing they could do to help him deal with Granada or Martin Bashir, and he asked me to come and meet Michael and see if there was anything that I could do or suggest to assist Mr. Jackson.
So in January, do you have any recollection of the exact date we're talking about?
I just know that I flew to Florida just before the last weekend in January. I'm not sure if that's the 27th or the 29th. But it was the last week of January.
So it would have been immediately before. Do you mean like a Friday, a Thursday? Do you have an idea?
Yeah, I think I arrived there either Wednesday night or Thursday. I'm not sure exactly.
Okay, and you met Mr. Jackson. Where did that meeting take place?
At the Turnberry. He had a suite at the Turnberry.
In his suite?
Yes.
Was Mr. Konitzer there?
Yes.
Was Mr. Weisner at that meeting?
I believe he was there for the initial meeting, yes.
What do you mean by that? Did he leave at some point?
That first day, I think I had 2 meetings with Mr. Jackson. And I'm not sure that Mr. Weisner was present at both. I think there were 2 meetings.
How many days did you stay at the Turnberry?
I didn't stay at the Turnberry.
How many days did you stay in Florida?
It was 4 or 5. I returned to Las Vegas that Sunday, the last Sunday in January of '03.
And in those 4 or 5 days, how many meetings did you have with Mr. Jackson? You mentioned 2 so far, I guess, the first day.
3 or 4. I'm really not exactly sure. One of them was the lengthy telephone conference day.
Tell me about that. What day did the telephone conference take place?
I'm not sure if it was Friday or Saturday, with the solicitor and the barristers in the UK.
Do you know if Hamid Moslehi was in Florida at the time you were there?
I don't know.
Do you know if the Arvizo family was in Florida at the time you were there?
I don't know. I don't believe so, but I don't know.
Did you ever meet Ian Drew?
I think I eventually met Ian Drew, but I'm not sure when. I don't believe I met him in Florida, though.
Okay, so tell me about this conference call day. You said it involved the professionals in England?
Yes.
Were you in a room where the conference call phone was?
Yes.
Who else was present in that room?
Mr. Jackson, Mr. Konitzer. I just don't remember if Mr. Weisner was present or not.
Anybody else?
There were other people who came in and out. I mean, there was a bodyguard. Mike, I just knew him as Mike. I really wasn't focused on anybody else. We had a table with a phone, and we spent close to 2 hours going over the Grenada documents and the issues associated with going after Grenada.
Did you discuss the public relations aspect of the Bashir documentary on Mr. Jackson?
There was some discussion that there was, likely to be, increased PR, and the solicitor-barrister team in the UK wanted to engage a PR firm.
So was Belliard employed at that time?
I don't think so. I think this was preliminary discussion. The UK folks weren't even 100% sure that they would follow through with taking any action. It was a very significant conversation, but it was also exploratory on their part.
And was Mr. Jackson concerned about the fallout in a public relations sense from the Martin Bashir film?
I don't recall Mr. Jackson making a specific statement about being concerned about the fallout from the Bashir film. He seemed very concerned about the blurring the images of his children, of wanting to enforce his agreement with Mr. Bashir to screen the video and edit the video before it was aired.
Let's talk about the agreements that you reviewed concerning the Bashir film. You expressed some concern after reviewing those agreements, true?
Yes.
Did you discuss those concerns with Mr. Jackson?
Yes.
Now, you were employed as Mr. Jackson's attorney, correct?
Yes.
Your fiduciary responsibility was to him?
Yes.
To him alone?
To him and his affiliated companies, yes.
Okay, so you owed no responsibility to Mr. Konitzer or Mr. Weisner.
As part of our representation of Mr. Jackson, we specifically disclosed to Mr. Konitzer that we would no longer, provide any representation to him, and we just had a conflict disclosure document.
To avoid a conflict of interest?
Yes, sir.
And do you have any sense of why Mr. Konitzer chose you to become a part of this team?
He stated to me that he appreciated that I had a perspective more of a businessman than a lawyer in some of our discussions, and that he wanted the kind of breadth of experience that I brought. That was what he expressed to me.
Did you have a sense that he liked you?
Yes.
Did you like Mr. Konitzer at the time?
Yes. I found Ronald to be pleasant and engaging.
Now, did you ever have a discussion with Mr. I'll back up. I think you did mention that you had a discussion with Mr. Jackson about entering into the agreement to do the Bashir interview.
Yes.
Did Mr. Jackson tell you that Martin Bashir was responsible for the Princess Diana documentary?
I don't think Mr. Jackson told me that, but somebody else did. I'm not sure who, but I did know that.
Did Mr. Jackson inform you that doing an interview with Mr. Bashir could be something that could reignite or renew his career?
Calls for speculation.
I'm asking if Mr. Jackson informed him of that.
No, Mr. Jackson never made such a statement.
I'm sorry. There's an objection pending. You need to rephrase the question, please.
My question is, Did Mr. Jackson ever inform you that he did the Martin Bashir interview because he perceived it to be a positive public relations opportunity to help renew his career?
No.
Did Mr. Jackson ever indicate that Martin Bashir was unwilling to do the interview in a fashion in which Mr. Jackson would be paid?
I don't believe Mr. Jackson ever made that statement to me. He did confirm to me that he did not expect money from, payment for the production, that he had agreed to do that without a fee.
Okay. And you mentioned you had some experience in business aspects of preparation of legal documents and such for these types of documentaries?
No. I indicated that I really had not had substantive experience in entertainment law.
Well, then, how is it that you were able to form an opinion that these documents were inadequate?
Because, from my experience in general commercial business, a vague, one-paragraph agreement is simply inadequate under any circumstance for just about any transaction, let alone something of this type. Secondly, I very quickly consulted with the Paul Hastings firm and had Mr. John Genga review the documents and discussed with him the agreements.
Now, are you aware that Mr. Jackson has engaged in numerous enterprises similar to this one that he engaged in with Mr. Bashir?
I'm really not aware of the scope of Mr. Jackson's enterprises.
You're aware he's an entertainer, correct?
Yes.
And that he engages in numerous contracts and business negotiations involving entertainment?
Yes.
And you realize that this particular documentary was a form of entertainment intended to be broadcast internationally on televisions, correct?
Yeah, I'm not sure about entertainment, but, yes, I agree it was a production for broadcast.
Okay. And are you aware of any policy or custom among journalists not to pay for interviews of this type?
Yes. I am aware that journalists generally, that's why I questioned the word entertainment, because my experience and understanding is that entertainment, they do pay. When it's news, documentary, interview, there is not payment customarily.
Alright, fair enough. Now, during the discussions with Mr. Jackson, I want to get back to this perception. Did Mr. Jackson in any way perceive this documentary to present him in a positive light?
Objection. Calls for speculation.
I'll rephrase that. That's fair. Did he ever indicate that to you, that he perceived that this production was going to portray him in a positive light?
Mr. Jackson expressed to me the language in these agreements that Mr. Bashir was to, and I'm paraphrasing. Mr. Bashir was to produce a documentary reflective of Mr. Jackson's life as Mr. Jackson knew it. Mr. Jackson's statement to me was that he felt very comfortable with Martin Bashir during the production of the various filmings, and that he expected Mr. Bashir to honor Mr. Bashir's agreement to allow Mr. Jackson to review the final footage and have some input to the final footage. We, the various lawyers, asked Mr. Jackson several times to explain what he meant by, faithful to his life as he knew it, and Mr. Jackson didn't use the word positive. He expected accuracy, sincerity in this documentary.
Okay, but is it safe to say that he saw this as a public relations opportunity?
I don't know what he saw it as.
Has Mr. Jackson ever expressed to you the public relations maxim that there is no such thing as bad publicity?
Mr. Jackson never made such a statement to me.
And in terms of the interview with Mr. Jackson, did you, as the lawyer, as Mr. Jackson's lawyer, you said you saw this particular production, correct?
I did eventually see it later. I think it was the week later, but yes.
And you certainly had a front row seat for the repercussions that ensued, fair to say?
Yes.
And would you agree that this production was a public relations disaster for Mr. Jackson?
I don't have a lot to judge by on the scale of PR events, but clearly this had a lot of negative aspects from the press. The initial press in the UK was very negative about Mr. Jackson. The initial press in the United States was, very negative. There were, what I would call talking heads, various people clamoring for an investigation of Mr. Jackson. There were people saying his children should be removed from his custody. So it was very negative.
Does that fit your definition of a disaster?
It comes pretty darned close.
You yourself used the word, a media frenzy. Is that what you described it as?
Yeah.
And that everything was frantic?
Yes.
And it was all negative, true?
Yeah, there were certainly some people who were standing up for Mr. Jackson, and there were certainly people who were highly negative of Martin Bashir's voiceovers, the editing. There was, largely negative. But there were certainly some people saying, hey, wait a minute. This was a hatchet job.
Let me just rephrase it. I'm not talking about the people who were reacting to, maybe reacting negatively towards Mr. Bashir. I'm talking about the people's reaction to this film. The people who saw this film or reacting to this film had a negative impression of Mr. Jackson.
Objection. Asked and answered.
I'll strike that. Now, you just said it was a hatchet job. Was it a hatchet job? Let's back up a moment. Isn't it a fact that the media frenzy, the bulk of this negative public relations disaster or whatever comes close to a disaster, dealt with Mr. Jackson's admission to the world that he liked to sleep with little boys? That was one of the major outcries. Isn't that fair to say?
I think that's fair to say.
And Martin Bashir did not misrepresent that, did he? Michael Jackson actually said that, and he repeated it, didn't he?
Objection. Calls for speculation.
Overruled.
Yes.
There's no confusion over what Michael Jackson likes to do with young boys, and that's what upset the world. Fair to say?
Objection. Argumentative. Misstates the evidence.
Sustained.
I'll strike it. And there was also a tremendous amount of negative public attention towards the fact that Mr. Jackson hung his child out over the balcony. Isn't that true?
That's true.
Mr. Jackson actually did that, didn't he?
As far as I know.
I mean, Martin Bashir didn't make that happen, did he?
I wasn't there, I didn't see it, but certainly that's what I've seen on the video.
So there's nothing unfair about Martin Bashir's commentary regarding that?
Objection. Calls for, excuse me, argumentative.
Sustained.
There was also a tremendous amount of negative attention given to Mr. Jackson's remarks about surgeries that he's had, and just people not believing he was being honest about that. Isn't that true? One of the things that people were concerned about?
You know, I find it difficult to answer questions about what people thought. I mean, what I know is what I saw reported in the press.
And that's where.
It's hard for me to say what's in people's minds. But I did see printed articles questioning the veracity of Mr. Jackson with respect to the number of surgeries.
And there was concern about the issues dealing with his children and keeping them from their mother, or not having a mother for his children, whether that was a good thing.
There were certainly some commentators who wrote about that issue.
And there was concern about the issue dealing with the kids at the zoo, the threat to the safety of his children when they went to the zoo, and there was somewhat of a media frenzy at that location?
Yeah. I remember some commentators questioning the propriety of that zoo trip.
And weren't these the very things that the media was most focused on in terms of this media frenzy? I mean, this list that I've given you? There are probably others, but
if you're asking me for my assessment of the media, I'd say you fairly well categorized the bulk of what was the uproar at that time, yes.
Okay. Now, do you know how long Mr. Jackson's relationship with Dieter Weisner, how far it pre-existed your involvement with Michael Jackson?
No, I don't. I mean, I don't know when that relationship began.
What about Mr. Konitzer?
Mr. Konitzer told me that he met Mr. Jackson through Mr. Weisner, and I believe that was in early 2002. But it could have been late, 01, but it was that time frame. It was not, back in the 1990s.
Do you know why there was a decision to clean house at this particular juncture in Mr. Jackson's business?
Well, I know what Mr. Jackson told me. And I know what Mr. Konitzer told me.
Alright, why don't you just tell me what Mr. Jackson told you?
Mr. Jackson told me that he no longer had confidence in John Branca. He was not pleased with Barry Siegel's handling of funds. And he was very interested and enthusiastic about the Konitzer 10-year MJ Universe business plan.
The MJ business plan was largely a plan to try and reinvent Mr. Jackson as a superstar, wasn't it?
To a degree, yes. I mean, originally the plan was premised upon acquiring a controlling interest in Marvel.
I'm sorry? Marvel?
Marvel, Spider-Man,
Okay.
Fantastic Four, etc.
And part of this was to market Michael Jackson's name and image in various other products? Was that part of the MJ Universe scheme of things?
Yes, that was part of it.
And Dieter Weisner had been involved in marketing Michael Jackson products for a long period of time. Isn't that true?
Yeah, I don't know for how long, but, yes, he was certainly involved, especially in Germany, in distribution of products.
And Michael Jackson had a long business relationship with Mr. Weisner, didn't he?
Yeah, again, I don't know how long, but from the paperwork I saw later, it was certainly a couple of years.
And based upon what you saw, you understood that Michael Jackson trusted Mr. Weisner based upon a long-standing business relationship, correct?
Again, I don't know how long-standing. Certainly Mr. Jackson seemed to have a good relationship with Mr. Weisner.
Alright, and Mr. Konitzer certainly had a longer relationship with Mr. Jackson than you did. Fair to say?
Yes.
And in part of this cleaning of house, Mr. Jackson decided to personally fire his attorney who he had been with for more than a decade.
Yes.
And he wrote a letter dismissing that attorney, didn't he?
Yes.
He decided to personally fire his business manager at the time?
Yes.
And he personally took care of that as well?
He executed documents that I delivered on his behalf, yes.
And you did that because that's what he told you he wanted to do?
Yes.
He personally fired his entertainment manager?
Yes.
Again, part of the cleaning house, part of what he wanted you to do.
Yes.
And then a month after hiring you, he personally fired you?
Yes. Well, 2 months, 3 months. But yes, 2 months.
Okay. And sometime in January, or before that time, Mr. Jackson decided that he wanted to put Ronald Konitzer and Dieter Weisner in charge of his enterprises?
Yes. That's what he told me.
Yes. That was his decision, correct?
As far as I know.
I mean, that's what Mr. Jackson told you, right?
Yes.
And as his attorney, you mentioned that you had a fiduciary duty to him, and part of that fiduciary duty is to keep him informed of everything, correct?
I'm not sure what everything is.
Everything that is material, everything that is important, everything that is necessary for him to make informed decisions, correct?
Yes.
Alright, so the month of February comes, and the Michael Jackson, Martin Bashir documentary airs. You said that things became frantic. Is that when things started to get frantic?
The pace picked up immediately when I returned to Las Vegas from Florida and we began interviewing for the replacement of the money manager.
And ultimately you settled on Ed Gross?
I think it's Ed Grossman.
Ed Grossman? Was that Michael Jackson's decision, based upon your advice, to choose Ed Grossman?
It was Ronald Konitzer. We discussed it. I know we had a phone call with Mr. Jackson, asked him if he wanted us to go ahead with that recommendation.
Did you inform him of all the particulars regarding that decision in hiring Ed Grossman?
Well, he had already told me, when I was in Florida, that he wanted to.
I'm sorry. Who?
Mr. Jackson had told me, when he was in Florida, that he wanted Barry Siegel to go and someone else to be engaged.
So did he?
And he told us to find somebody, appropriate.
Okay. And did he ultimately okay or make the decision to go with Ed Grossman?
I don't remember a specific, yes, go with Ed Grossman, conversation. I know that Ed Grossman met with Barry Siegel. Barry Siegel requested authority from Mr. Jackson for transferring, and we provided that authority in the form of a document signed by Mr. Jackson to Mr. Siegel instructing him to transfer.
Okay. So Mr. Jackson signed a document basically instructing that the transfer of his business management interests were going to Ed Grossman?
Well, the cash management.
Yeah, the cash management. Ed Grossman is international business management, correct?
I think so, yes.
IBM, right? So that transaction can't occur without Mr. Jackson's permission, correct?
Well, Mr. Konitzer and Dieter Weisner had a limited power of attorney. I'm not sure, as I sit here, whether that was within the scope of power or not, whether they could have done that. But my belief is, my recollection is that Mr. Jackson authorized the transfer to Ed Grossman, International Business Management.
Did you prepare that limited power of attorney?
Yes, I did.
And you have no recollection of whether it gives Ronald Konitzer the authority to make that transfer on his own?
I know there were some limitations on what the authority was, but I don't remember the specifics. I haven't looked at that document now for a very long time.
And do you recall who directed you as to what limitations were to be placed on Mr. Konitzer regarding that power of attorney?
Actually, I was the one who created limitations, and I specifically consulted with Mr. Jackson about that.
Do you consider Mr. Jackson to be intelligent, an intelligent person?
Yes.
When he had business discussions with you, would he ask intelligent questions?
Sometimes more than others. But, yes.
So we go into the month of February. Did this public relations frenzy get better, or worse, or stay the same? You tell me.
I'm not sure that I can characterize it. It was certainly bad, and as the program aired in the US, there was continued press. I'm not sure how long that that continued.
At some point you brought Anne Gabriel on?
Yes.
That was your decision?
Not mine alone.
Who else participated in that?
Mr. Konitzer.
Did you recommend Anne Gabriel?
Yes.
And she was to help out with the US public relations end of things, is that correct?
Yes.
And we're talking about crisis management here, aren't we, in terms of public relations? Public relations crisis management?
Yes.
And eventually, was Belliard hired before Anne Gabriel came on?
Yes.
And Belliard is a crisis management public relations outfit, correct?
It's certainly among their qualifications. They do a variety of PR work.
Have you ever seen their letterhead?
Yes.
And their letterhead says, crisis management.
Yes.
Doesn't it?
Yes.
Okay, so this was a public relations crisis, true?
Yes.
And Mr. Jackson was certainly aware of that?
I believe so, yes.
Okay, so at some point Anne Gabriel felt that the public relations end of things was being mishandled in the United States. Isn't that true?
Yes.
She told you, or basically she informed you about the idea that Mr. Jackson should be more proactive?
Yes, that was her position.
And there was a sentiment among Mr. Jackson's people that this should be. That they should not be proactive and that they should hunker down and weather this storm out?
Objection. Vague.
That's probably true. I'm not specific enough. Was there a consensus among anybody in Michael Jackson's inner circle that this storm should be weathered by hunkering down and avoiding the spotlight?
I'm not sure there was consensus. There was certainly voices, on all sides of how to address the PR aspects.
But hunkering down was viewed as a legitimate PR strategy, is that true?
Yeah.
Objection. Vague.
Oh, sorry.
Overruled. You may answer.
Yes. I mean, subsequently Mr. Desenhall was engaged, and his advice consistently was to, as you say, hunker down.
And he was the man who replaced Anne Gabriel, correct?
I'm not sure I would use the word replaced. But Eric was certainly engaged to shoulder a significant portion of the PR strategy responsibility.
Now, as the month of February went on, were there other public relations issues that added to the media frenzy?
I don't recall. Do you have an example?
Well, let's talk about the 60 Minutes interview, the planned 60 Minutes interview at Neverland. Do you remember about the date that was to take place?
I think it was the first full weekend in February.
And would you agree that it's a bad idea from a public relations standpoint to agree to have 60 Minutes interview you? Have them come out, set up, bring their whole staff out to the West Coast, Ed Bradley, and then not show up for the interview?
Objection. Foundation. Argumentative.
Sustained.
Okay, I'll back up a little bit. Mr. Jackson didn't show up to the 60 Minutes interview, did he?
Objection. Foundation.
Sustained.
You were there when 60 Minutes was preparing to shoot an interview with Michael Jackson, correct?
I was at Neverland at that time, yes.
Okay, did 60 Minutes ever shoot that interview featuring Ed Bradley and Michael Jackson?
No.
And the reason for that is because Michael Jackson didn't show up for the interview, correct?
You can't shoot an interview if the interviewee is not cooperative.
Yes. And he decided to change his mind and not do that interview?
That's my understanding, yes.
And one of the reasons for that was because the complaint regarding the Geordie Chandler case had just come out on the smoking gun. Isn't that true?
Objection. Foundation.
Sustained.
Move to strike.
That's fair. Do you know, well, let me start over again. The Geordie Chandler complaint had just been published on the smoking gun, the internet source for various documents. Isn't that true?
Objection. Foundation.
Sustained.
Are you aware if there was a publication of Mr. Jackson's, or I should say Geordie Chandler's complaint against Michael Jackson on the smoking gun at that time?
I remember that there was some publication on the smoking gun of some Chandler-related materials, but I'm not sure that I knew of that when I was at Neverland on that Saturday or not. I'm not sure when I learned of that in relation to that day. I may have known it. I just don't remember.
Were there also prominent articles regarding Mr. Jackson's distressed financial condition during the month of February 2003 that contributed to this media frenzy?
I'm not sure whether contributed is the right word. I think they were part of the media attention to Mr. Jackson and his affairs, and yes, I remember some postings and articles about his financial affairs.
Let's talk a little bit about Mr. Jackson's financial affairs. You said you'd done quite a bit of research into this area?
I'm not sure I said research, but I certainly exerted a considerable amount of my effort and attention went to getting a grasp of Mr. Jackson's financial situation and financial affairs.
Okay, so what would you call that?
Well, I mean, research to me is, as a lawyer, research is kind of technical. You go to LexisNexis and such. But, clearly I was trying to get up to speed and obtain knowledge in order to properly advise Mr. Jackson.
And you became aware that Mr. Jackson had a $200 million loan with the Bank of America that encumbered or was pledged against his ATV catalog with Sony.
Yeah, I think it's the other way around, though.
The catalog.
Mr. Jackson had pledged his ownership interest in the Sony ATV joint venture. That's the pledge of the collateral to Bank of America.
Yes.
Yes.
He had a $70 million loan for which he had pledged his interest in the MIJAC catalog with the Bank of America.
Yes.
And you were aware that Mr. Jackson had accrued this enormous debt to help finance his very expensive lifestyle?
I'm not sure what I knew about how the debt accrued. And that's the only piece. I knew he accrued the debt and I knew he didn't have a lot of assets to show for the money that had been spent from those loans.
Well, didn't you write a letter to Mr. Jackson telling him that he's spending approximately $20,000 more every year than he makes, or I should say $20 million more every year than he makes?
Yes.
I have a hard time saying that.
Yeah, I did write a letter. My analysis was more current. I just mean I didn't review his expenses going back for, how the entire $200 million of debt came into existence. That's all I meant.
All right.
Clearly I was concerned about his current rate of expenditure versus the money he had available to cover those expenses.
And you mentioned in that letter that you perceived Mr. Jackson to be on the verge of bankruptcy unless some action was taken, true?
Yes, that's true.
You also talk a little bit about the fact that he has $10 million in unpaid vendors, correct?
Yes.
Some of those bills go back years. Is that fair to say?
Objection. Court order.
Sustained.
And as far as your testimony about the value of this ATV catalog, you said that you are not an expert in this area. Isn't that accurate?
Correct.
You really have no idea about what Mr. Jackson's interest is in the ATV catalog, correct?
I certainly have an idea. I can't say I'm a qualified business appraiser capable of fully evaluating that asset, no.
Well, are you aware that Bank of America at the time had a right of first refusal on that asset?
I did find that out. I'm not sure exactly when. These were a lot of documents that we had to digest, so this took a few weeks. But eventually I did come to learn that. But I'm not sure, actually, I'm not so sure that the bank.
I'm sorry, I misspoke.
Objection. He's cutting off the witness.
You can finish your answer.
I don't think the bank had the right. I think Sony actually, whether it was Sony or Sony, ATV itself had a first right on Mr. Jackson's interests.
You're correct. I think I misspoke. I meant to say Sony. So Sony had a right of first refusal on that catalog?
Yes.
So he didn't have the right to sell it without Sony's permission, correct? Or without giving Sony the right to buy it first?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, and as far as your general knowledge of this, I'm just looking back at some of the words you said. You said you're not up to speed on his interest in this catalog, so you don't really know what it's worth.
I looked at some of the public, materials available about Sony and Sony, ATV. I did talk to a couple of people in the industry, just in general, about, what do these catalogs sell for, what kind of value. At the time, this was during, I was very concerned about the value, though, because at the time we had the rise of the internet and, pirating of material, and so there was concern over the future of revenue streams to be derived from some of these large catalogs because of the piracy that was rampant.
And that concerned these catalogs?
So that affects catalog values. the right to first refusal affect catalog values? I mean, because it's not just the underlying asset. It wasn't that simple, as most dealings involving hundreds of millions of dollars are not simple. And so to say to someone, oh, you can write a check and buy this for X dollars, it just wasn't that easy.
And those concerns that you had were concerns that the catalog really wasn't worth what it had been previously appraised at, true?
Well, I didn't know that. Let me put it this way. I believe that a good, strong scenario existed to get to the numbers that I posited, that 200 million. But those were not meant to be precise. They were meant to be an illustration of what could be achieved. Sony had bought additional assets into that catalog. I had no way of knowing exactly at that moment in time what Sony had paid, what debts the catalog had to repay Sony for any of that investment. Sony was funding the enhancement of the catalog. They continued to put money in and purchase more assets. I have to believe that Sony were good business people and that they were buying assets that had good value and would continue to have value. But ultimately, to work with the financial elements of something like this, you would have to have, a Goldman Sachs or some sort of investment banking firm come in and do analysis, review. And it's been widely reported in the press that happened in the last few months, 6 months or whatever.
So you didn't consider the fact that, or you didn't factor in your analysis, the fact that Sony had been depositing copyrights into this catalog over a period of years. Mr. Jackson had deposited no additional copyrights into this catalog, thereby decreasing Mr. Jackson's relative interest in the ATV catalog? You didn't factor that into your analysis, did you? Yes, or no?
I'm not sure that's a correct statement.
Well, didn't you factor in that Mr. Jackson just had a half interest in whatever the catalog was worth? Isn't that what your simple dynamic was?
My dynamic view rested on that. I did not take into account whether or not there was a right on Sony's part to get paid back for invested dollars first. I did not consider that possibility at that time.
And you didn't consider it to be a possibility that Sony was going to gift Mr. Jackson interest in those copyrights that they were depositing over those years, did you?
I don't expect Sony to gift much of anything to anybody. But it wasn't about gifting the copyrights. Mr. Jackson owned half of the entity that owned the copyrights.
Right. But owning half of the entity doesn't mean his financial interest is 50-50, does it?
No. From a legal perspective, those two are readily separable.
Okay. And I want to talk about his financial interest in that catalog, so I want to focus on your knowledge about those facts. Were you aware that Mr. Jackson had been receiving guaranteed payments on the royalties from that catalog that in effect reduced his financial interest in the ATV catalog substantially over a number of years? Were you aware of that?
At the time I wrote that letter, no. I actually became aware of that later in a conversation with Mr. Malnick.
So you know now that his interest in that catalog is not worth half of whatever its market value is?
Objection. Foundation.
Sustained.
And if a financial expert who had considered all these dynamics came into court and testified that Mr. Jackson's interest in that catalog is, at most, $200 million total, you would have no reason to quibble with that, would you?
Objection. Improper question.
Sustained.
Well, let me just summarize that you really didn't consider all the factors to ascertain exactly what Mr. Jackson's financial interest is in the ATV catalog, correct?
I did not consider all of the possible factors, correct.
So you cannot tell us. You really don't have an idea of how much Mr. Jackson's financial interest is worth in the ATV catalog, true?
I never pretended to really know, as a qualified business appraiser, what the value of Mr. Jackson's interest in that catalog was.
Okay.
I was merely trying to suggest a course of action that could determine that value and hopefully produce a positive economic outcome for Mr. Jackson.
Who is Fire Mountain?
Fire Mountain is a limited liability company that was formed in Nevada, and it is a 100% owned subsidiary, I believe, of MJJ Productions.
Are you aware of covenants and conditions in the Bank of America loans that prevent Mr. Jackson from encumbering the ATV catalog or the MIJAC catalog in any way additionally encumbering those assets?
Yes.
Okay. And are you aware that the covenants and conditions of the Bank of America loan have some very rigorous guidelines about income for Mr. Jackson?
I eventually obtained those loan documents and became better acquainted with the provisions in those documents.
And one of the reasons for those covenants and conditions is because if Mr. Jackson was to come into any additional wealth, Bank of America was to be informed of it so that they could get in line to help pay for interest. pay down those loans. Isn't that true?
I'm not sure I'd like to defer to the language of the document. There is no question that Bank of America replenished the credit line note through, I believe it's the MIJAC catalog. Revenues would be deposited to replenish that credit line.
Do you know if the formation, let me back up a moment. What was the purpose of Fire Mountain LLC?
It was to isolate liability, any liabilities associated with the production of the Take-Two video.
Was it also designed to be used to isolate liabilities in association with other Fox releases, like the home movies, anything of that nature?
Not initially.
But it developed into that?
There was, I believe that eventually did result. But that wasn't the initial, that concept didn't exist at the time of the formation of Fire Mountain.
Did Anne Gabriel express a concern about making the Take-Two documentary a money-making enterprise?
Yes.
She perceived that to be negative in terms of public relations. That this should be done without any profit motive or any profit on behalf of Mr. Jackson, didn't she?
Yes.
And that advice was not heeded, was it?
No.
And the reason for that is because Mr. Jackson was in severe financial distress, true?
He had payables of about 10 million, and cash in the tens of thousands.
About 30,000 in cash?
Whether it was 30 or 40 I don't recall, but it was not near enough to pay for his payables.
In addition, it was not nearly enough to pay for Mr. Jackson's current lifestyle. I mean, he didn't have the funds to pay for his current lifestyle, assuming a spending rate that he had exhibited in the past?
Clearly the payables accumulated to the $10 million level because the bills had not been paid previously.
Okay. When you say that the LLC, Limited Liability Corporation, Fire Mountain, was designed to limit or isolate liability, what do you mean by that?
Generally, it's my understanding that the members of a limited liability company are not directly liable for the obligations of the company. So it has the kind of limited liability that a corporation would have.
And you set that up?
Yes.
Who was authorized to sign on behalf of Fire Mountain LLC?
For a while I was.
Was Mr. Jackson is he also somebody who could sign on behalf of Fire Mountain?
We ultimately delivered documents that MJJ Productions was the member and had the authorization to sign. And I believe Mr. Jackson was the principal officer of MJJ Productions.
And the proceeds from the Take-Two production, or the rebuttal film, all of the proceeds for that video or film went into Fire Mountain, is that correct?
Yes.
And there was a trust account established for Fire Mountain, isn't that true?
Yes.
And didn't you set up that trust account?
I set up a trust account for a while, and ultimately that trust account was transferred to another attorney.
Okay, but during the month of February 2003, you were in control of that trust account, weren't you?
My firm had that trust account, yes.
Okay, and $3 million came in from Fox for the Take-Two production, correct?
I think that's right, in the aggregate. It didn't all come in at one time.
But it came in installments during the month of February 2003?
I'm not sure of the timing. But certainly some of it was in February. It might have been all in February. I'm really not sure.
Alright, if I could just have a moment. Come on, I'm about to give up on this backing. I'm going to show you a document which I intend to mark as People's Exhibit 898, and I'm doing so at this time. It appears to be a 5-page document with a Hale Lane fax as the first page. Would you identify that for me, sir?
This looks like the trust listings from Hale Lane.
And did you send that document to Michael Jackson at Neverland Ranch?
Yes.
On what date?
April 1, 2003.
And did you do that as part of your duties as his attorney to keep him aware of financial matters regarding Fire Mountain LLC?
I did this as part of the wrapping up process of my responsibility for matters for Mr. Jackson other than the Granada litigation.
Yes. But my question is, was that communication made to inform Mr. Jackson of financial matters regarding the Fire Mountain LLC?
Yes.
Okay. It's an accounting, isn't it?
Yes.
I'd ask to move People's Exhibit 898 into evidence at this time.
No objection.
It's admitted.
And if we could have the Elmo. Mr. LeGrand, in terms of the proceeds from the Fox production. The Take-Two production, you were essentially, sorry about that. You were in charge of disbursement of funds, correct?
Well, in my view, The funds belonged to Mr. Jackson, and Mr. Konitzer and Mr. Weisner had authority.
I'm sorry, sir. You need to talk into the.
Oh, I'm sorry. The funds belonged ultimately to Mr. Jackson through his company. And Mr. Konitzer and Mr. Weisner had the power to direct expenditures. So I didn't.
Mr. Weisner had the power to direct expenditures?
Mr. Konitzer and Mr. Weisner had authority from Mr. Jackson, pursuant to the power of attorney, to direct expenditures.
Did Mr. Weisner and Mr. Konitzer have powers of attorney?
There was one power that was joint.
Okay. And Mr. Jackson signs many powers of attorneys, doesn't he?
Objection. Foundation.
Sustained.
You have prepared more than one power of attorney for Mr. Jackson, have you not?
I don't recall more than the one power getting executed. There may have been more than one draft of a power, but I don't remember more than one power actually getting executed.
You have seen a number of powers of attorneys that have been executed by Michael Jackson, have you not?
I'm not sure.
Alright, I'll come back to that. Let's go down this list. The very first entry that we have here shows an incoming wire from Fox Broadcasting Company of $750,000. Was that part payment for the Take-Two production?
Yes.
Alright, there is a disbursement to Stuart Backerman, right here on the second line, February 13, 2003, $6,000. Who's Stuart Backerman?
Mr. Backerman was a PR person.
Okay, and he was part of this, maybe on the outer fringes of this team. Addressing the media crisis?
He was engaged in providing media services for Mr. Jackson, yes.
So there's, on 2 to 13, there's a disbursement of, I believe that's $50,000. I'm sorry. So you can see that, I believe that's $80,000 to Hale Lane. Is that $80,000 to pay for your legal fees?
That was to the firm to pay for legal services, yes.
So that paid for your services. And then there's an $11,000 cash disbursement. Do you know where that went, on 2 to 13?
It went in a wire. That's reflective of the wire to Katrine Konitzer, I believe.
Now, there's funds sent Western Union, $2,000 to Katrine Konitzer. Are you saying this $11,000 figure is related to Katrine Konitzer?
I'm not sure. The $11,000, there's the next entry of distribution of $11,000 cash to purchase.
Okay.
And I think that the $11,000 is composed of the $2,000 to Catherine, the $4,500 to Sandra, and the $4,500, anyway, the $4,500, $4,500 and $2,000 equaled the $11,000.
Do you know who Sandra Hawk is?
I believe she's an assistant to Mr. Konitzer. That's what I was told.
Somebody who worked for Mr. Konitzer.
Yes.
And what about Canon Kasakshi?
I believe that. I was told that was a consultant working with Mr. Konitzer.
Okay. On Mr. Jackson's behalf?
Yes.
Do you know what type of consultant?
No.
Next we have, on the same date, $150,000 going out to Neverland Valley Entertainment.
Yes.
You sent that?
My firm wired that money, yes.
Did you have anything to do with it?
I'm sure I did.
Okay, that's my question. So you were involved in sending out $150,000 to Neverland Valley Entertainment, is that fair to say?
Yes.
I take it that went to your client, Mr. Jackson?
It went to Neverland Valley Entertainment.
I'm sorry, I'm misspeaking. Neverland Valley Entertainment is not Mr. Jackson, is it?
I believe that's a corporation that is. I believe that's not owned by Mr. Jackson.
Okay, it's not owned by Mr. Jackson? Only tell me if you know.
There were some confusing names. I'm not sure. I'm really not sure today. I'm sorry.
Under whose direction did you send that $150,000 out to Neverland Valley Entertainment?
Mr. Konitzer and Mr. Weisner.
Okay, next you sent out a wire for Mr. Konitzer, $90,000, correct?
Yes.
Mr. Konitzer's direction, $10,000 for Gabriel Media. That would be Ann Gabriel?
Yes.
Whose direction was that?
Ronald Konitzer's.
Okay. Dieter Weisner got $110,000. I'm assuming that was Mr. Konitzer and Mr. Weisner's directive?
Yes.
Joseph Marcus, $35,000. Who told you to send Joseph Marcus $35,000?
Mr. Konitzer and Mr. Weisner.
Okay. Do you know who Joseph Marcus is?
I believe he's the, I'm not sure what his title is. He helps run Neverland for Mr. Jackson.
All right.
Let's take our break.